Now that you know how to import data into Matlab, I'm going to show you how to export data out of Matlab. Also, similar to the previous video, there are several ways to export data from Matlab onto the hard disk. There are several easy ways, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. There are also more, let's say, more flexible ways that require a little bit more code. But that method relies on some control functions that you haven't yet learned about in this course. So you will learn more about exporting data in more complicated ways, more flexible ways later on in the course. So I already mentioned that the best kind of file, the most convenient file format for working with in MATLAB is the matlab.mat file. So to save data into a .mat file, it's really easy. You just use the function save. And the function save has several possible inputs. The first input has to be the MATLAB file that you are going to write out. So I'm going to create a new file on the computer in this folder, the folder where I currently am, and that file is going to be called mymatlabvariables.mat. Of course, if you don't want to save in the current file folder, you want to save somewhere else, then you can specify, something like users mxc, whatever is the path, you can specify a full path over here. So that's the first input into the save function. It is the data file, the name of the data file that you want to write out. All of the other optional inputs are the variables that you want to save, the variables that you want to export. So we're going to export a variable called data, a variable called Amsterdam, and a variable called x. So let's run this line and see what happens. We get an error, and the error says variable data not found. In fact, I've cleared the workspace from the previous video, so I actually got rid of all of these variables. So let's create a new file called data. Let's say data equals, I'm going to set it to be random numbers, and how about 15 rows and 2 columns. So this is just, I can let you look at this. This is just a small matrix of random numbers. So now I'm going to run this line again. Now it says variable Amsterdam not found. Okay, I'm sure you see where this is going. We need to create a variable called Amsterdam and also a variable called x. So let's just say Amsterdam equals 3 and x equals ASDF. I'll make that a character array. Now I run this file, or this line of code, and now I want to confirm that that file really exists. So there's two ways that you can look at the files that are in the current workspace. Actually, there's several ways. You can also do it if you click on Home and then Layout and then Current Folder. So that's one way you can see. Where's that data file that we created? My MATLAB variables. And this is pretty handy. This actually tells us, even though we haven't imported the data, this little widget down here tells us what's contained inside that data, or that data file. So another method you can use is to type ls, which lists all of the files that are in the current folder. But even more handy is a special MATLAB function called what. So you already know whose, and now here's a different function, what. And what is a pretty neat function because it will list not just, not all of the files in the current folder, but all of the MATLAB files. So this is telling us that all of the MATLAB code files in the current folder are these 3, and all of the mat files in the current folder are these 2. So we have these MATLAB data files and these MATLAB text files or scripts or functions. So this is pretty handy because you might have a lot of files. Maybe you have dozens or hundreds of files in the current folder, and you're only interested in the MATLAB format files. So then you can use this function, what. All right, so this is for saving some number of variables. So, if you only want to save the variable x, you can do it like this. Notice, by the way, I forgot to mention this explicitly, but all the variable names are contained in single quotes and separated by commas. Now you can also just type save. If you just type save the function on its own, it's going to save the entire workspace, every single variable that you have in the Matlab workspace in the memory buffer into a file called matlab.mat. So I'm going to run this. It gives us an output message that says it saves the data to matlab.mat. Now, I say not recommended here, and that's because, in this context here for teaching, we have very, very little information in the workspace. It's just a couple of variables. But when you are doing real practical hands-on MATLAB processing, you might be doing data analyses or simulations. You might have a lot of variables in your workspace. Your workspace memory might be huge. It could be 4 gigabytes. It might be 12 gigabytes of information that you have in this file, in the MATLAB buffer, but you don't actually need to save, or maybe you don't actually need to store all 12 gigabytes of information. So that's why I generally don't recommend just typing save. All right, so that was for MATLAB format data files. Now I'm going to show you how to export a simple text file. So this is useful. So the function name is dlmwrite, and it's useful when your data are just a matrix of numbers, particularly a vector or a two-dimensional matrix, just like this data matrix here. So dlmwrite, the DLM stands for delimiter. So the way this function works is you specify the first input into the function is the file name. So that's very similar to the save command. Then the second input is the variable, the matrix or the vector that you want to write out. And now this is unfortunately a little bit different from how save works, because here you have to put the variable names in single quotes, and here you don't. Here you just directly input the data matrix or the variable here. And then the third input is a /t. This is the delimiter here. This slash is indicating that we're going to use a special character. So the /t is for tab. You can also export using a space. So if you want the numbers to be separated by a space, or if you want the numbers to be separated by a comma, maybe you want the numbers to be separated by an asterisk, whatever you like. But a tab is pretty typical. So this would be a tab delimited file. So now I'm going to run this line of code here, and then I'm going to show you what that file looks like. So here it's actually not really nicely formatted, but this is tab formatted. It's just because of the spacing that it looks like it's narrower here in the second column in these rows and wider in these rows. Okay, and then the final thing, the penultimate thing I'm going to show you in this video is exporting as Excel format. So here I'm just creating some random numbers. This is a matrix of 4 by 5, so 4 rows and 5 columns. Then I'm multiplying that number, or this random matrix, by 25, and then rounding those numbers. So there's nothing really magical about this. I just wanted to make some integers in a pretty reasonable range going up to around 25. So this is the matrix. And now what I'm going to do is use the function xlswrite, and then you can see that the general approach to these, the format of these output functions is very similar across the different ones. So the first input is the file name .xlsx, and then the data file that we want to read. Again, you can see in this comment, this line of code is not going to work if you do not have Microsoft Office installed on your computer. Now, I actually don't recommend using xlswrite, and in fact I recommend against using Excel format files in MATLAB. And the reason is because you might be working on a Windows computer or a Mac, but the person you might be sharing these data with, these data files with, might be using a Linux computer. So then it's going to be more annoying for them to import the data, even though it's easier for you. So instead, if you want to use a different file format that can be interpreted by Excel, but is also easy to import for people who don't have Microsoft Office on their computer, then you can use something called CSV. CSV is for comma separated values. In fact, CSV write is essentially the same thing as DLM write. So here I showed you delimiter write. We input the name of the output file, the matrix we want to output, And here we can specify any possible delimiter, so that the character that goes between all of the numbers within a row. And with CSV write, it's essentially the same thing as DLM write, but it's always going to use commas to separate these different variables or different values in the matrix. So I run this code, and let me load this thing up here. You can see it's going to, so it's called filename.csv, and on my computer it's set to import these data automatically in Excel. But someone else who doesn't have Excel could use OpenOffice or any other spreadsheet software to open this data file. So there you go, several easy, convenient ways to get data out of Matlab and into a file on your hard drive. The one that I recommend the most is using matlab.mat format data files. These are most convenient for other people who are going to be importing your files, or you who will be importing your files into Matlab. And then, as I mentioned, the only one I have a mild recommendation against is Excel format files, and that's really just because it relies on the person who might be taking your data to also have Microsoft Office.